They threw him into the desert to die. 80 li of bare sand, a gift from his own brothers, a present meant to kill him. But he knelt, rubbed the sand between his fingers, and smiled. Because under this dead earth, water was sleeping, and he was the only man in the world who knew how to hear it. Chon Ison opens his eyes to a white sky and hands that are not his. Too young, too thin, too pale. The last thing he remembers is the screech of tires leaving asphalt, the smell of burning rubber, and then nothing. Now, a wooden cart bounces him over rocks, and his skull splits with pain so sharp he nearly blacks out again. Beside him sits a small chest, a scroll, and a letter with a broken seal. He grabs the side of the cart and looks around. Sand, in every direction. Nothing but sand and wind and a sun that wants to burn everything beneath it. He flexes his fingers. They obey. Whatever happened, wherever he is, these hands are his now. He picks up the letter. The script is not Korean, not Chinese, not Japanese, but he reads every stroke as if he had known it since birth. It comes from a man named Chon Ison. It calls him brother. It tells him he has received the most generous portion of their father's estate, 80 li of open land in a territory called Somak. The words drip contempt behind polite manners. Manage their father's generosity with wisdom, it says. He folds the letter and looks at the sand. 80 li of this, his generous inheritance. He almost laughs. The cart hits a rock. His teeth clack. He tastes blood. No laughing yet. The driver halts the horses on a low dune and points ahead. That is Somak. He will go no further. There is no water. Ison climbs down, and his legs nearly fold. This body is weak, underfed. He feels the ribs through the thin robe. He steadies himself and looks. A crumbled wall, 3 caved roofs, a well that is now just a hole full of dry stones. The driver turns the cart around without a goodbye, and the wheels creak and fade, and then there is only silence, and Ison, alone on a dune with sand in his teeth. He kneels. He scoops a handful of sand and rubs it slow between his fingers. Quartz with feldspar, white crust on the surface, salt, but only surface salt, which means water. Lived here once, not long ago. He digs deeper, darker grains, slightly damp. His heart kicks. He reads the dunes. Their ridges run northeast to southwest, so the wind comes from the northwest. Predictable. He can work with that. He turns south to the low-layered hills, sedimentary. If this basin is what he thinks, then somewhere beneath his feet, a water table waits. 15 meters down, maybe 20, but it is there. And in his old life, he spent 11 years studying how water moves through Earth. He mapped aquifers in the Gobi. He built drip systems that fed a hectare on what a bathtub holds. His last project before the crash was a salt flat reclamation he never finished. Now he stands inside that unfinished experiment, swallowed whole. He walks to the ruined buildings, sets down the chest, unrolls the scroll. A land deed. His name, Chon Ison, 4th son of the House of Chon, Lord of Somak, Lord of Nothing, Lord of 80 li of sand his brothers gave him to die on. He follows fresh footprints past a collapsed wall and finds them. 8 people in the shade of a half-standing granary. 4 men, 3 women, 1 child. Thin faces, patched clothes, eyes that expect nothing good. The oldest, a white-haired man, stands and bows, shallow. He names himself Pak Min-hu, steward of Somak. They have been waiting, he says. He does not say, they are glad. These people are starving, slowly thinning out like candles burning from both ends. He asks how much water they have. 2 jars, 5 days, if careful. After that, they walk 20 li to a stream every 8 days. 4 days of travel out of every 8 just for water, half their lives hauling it across sand. He asks about the well. dry for 6 years. He turns south, then walks 300 paces east to where the ground dips so slightly you would miss it. The sand here is a shade darker. 3 camel thorn bushes grow in a loose triangle. Their roots run deep. They do not grow where there is no moisture. Between them, the sand carries a faint dark stain that is not shadow. He presses his palm flat, cooler than the surrounding sand. A line of darkling beetles crawls out from the base of the dune, coming from the damp patch, drinking condensation off the cooler ground. Everything points the same way. He walks back and says 3 words, dig right here. Pak Min-hoo stares at the bare ground, then at him. He thinks Ison is mad. The hard-eyed woman breathes a near laugh through her nose. A young man mutters the word fool. Ison points at the bushes. Their roots go down 15 to 18 chi. They do not grow without deep water. He points at the dark sand, groundwater rising through the fine grains. He points at the beetles drinking the moisture. Dig here and you find water within 18 chi. And if I am wrong, he says, you can all leave and I will not stop you. Pak Min-hoo is silent a long time. Then he tells the others to get the shovels. They dig that day and through the next morning. By noon of the second day, a man stands in the hole and cannot see over the rim. Nothing but dry sand. Yun Bora, the hard-eyed woman, climbs out and calls it a waste, burning calories they cannot replace on a madman's guess. Ison sits on the rim, eyes closed, reviewing the sediment layers, the dip of the hills, the grain size of everything they have dug. It all still points to water. He cannot make it come faster. He can only be right and wait. Keep digging, he says. 1 more day. On the 4th morning, Pak Min-hoo's shovel hits something soft. A wet thud. Dark sand clings to the blade. Damp. Cold. He digs again and water seeps into the bottom of the shaft. Slow, then faster. Brown, then clearing. Within an hour, a pool stands, knee-deep, cold, and clean. Pak Min-hoo sinks into the water to his waist, brings up both dripping hands, presses them to his face, and his shoulders shake. The child wakes, runs over, screams that there is water in a voice so high it echoes off the dunes. Ison watches the old man weep in the well, and something tightens in his chest, older than pride. Then his mind clicks back. 50 liters an hour, enough for 100 people and a garden. Good, not great. He turns south to where the ground dips again, near a cluster of stones. Second well, right there. Tomorrow. That night, they eat the last of their grain, boiled in the new water. And Pak Min-hoo swears it tastes different. Ison knows water cannot change boiled barley. But he says nothing and eats. The old man sits beside him on the broken wall. 27 years steward, he says. 3 lords before this one. 1 drank himself dead. 1 fled after 2 months. 1 died of fever. Nobody stays in Somak. I will stay, says Ison. And for the first time, the old man's eyes hold something that is not just endurance. Not trust yet. The space where trust might grow. Like the damp patch between 3 bushes where no one would think to dig. Over 3 days, Ison walks all 80 li with a stick and a piece of charcoal and the back of his deed for paper. Every dune, every dip, every patch of discolored sand, every hardy plant, every insect trail. He tastes the sand for salt, counts his steps, converts them to meters, watches the shadows. By the 3rd day, he holds a map of the basin, more detailed than anything this world has made, and from it, a plan takes shape. Not grand, survival. 3 wells at intervals that will not drain a single point. A first channel to link them. A windbreak of brush along the northwest edge. A test plot of barley and beans in the most sheltered hollow. 4 months to first harvest, if it goes right. They will be hungry and exhausted, but they will not die. He gathers everyone at the well and does not give a speech. He crouches and draws in the sand, a circle for the well, a line south to the 2nd, a line southeast to the 3rd, channels, a rectangle for the field. Wash the salt out and the barley grows, he says. The beans feed the dirt and make it stronger. Pak Min-hoo asks one question. Are you sure? The way you were sure about the first one. I am sure about the water, says Ison. The rest depends on whether you can dig and plant and haul every day for 4 months without stopping. Yunbora asks, what if the second well is dry? It will not be dry. How do you know? The same way I knew about the first. The plants and the bugs and the sand do not lie. They speak a language no one here has learned to hear. She stares at him a long moment. Then she picks up a shovel and asks where exactly to start. They begin the next morning. He marks the spot with a cairn and splits the group 4 to dig, 4 to start the first channel, a shallow trench lined with clay he found at the foot of the southern hills. He mixes the clay with sand and straw to harden it, angles the trench so gravity carries the water downhill on a slope too gentle for the eye to catch. They do not understand why it matters. They do it because the first well bought him that much. 1 miracle of water paid for a week of obedience. He will keep paying. Every well, every green shoot, another month of their faith. Be wrong even once, and it all collapses, and he is alone in the desert with a dead man's name. The second well hits water on the 3rd day, shallower than the first, 12 chi. The flow stronger, 70 liters an hour. No one cries this time, but something shifts in their faces. 1 well was luck. 2 out of 2 is not luck. That evening, Pak Min-hoo comes and bows deep, the kind of bow that means something here. I served 3 lords, and none gave Somak anything, he says. You gave it water. Stand up, says Ison. I gave nothing. The water was always there. You just did not know where to look. The old man rises and looks at him with those deep-lined eyes. That, he says, is exactly what I mean. The 3rd well took longer. 5 days of digging through compacted sand that fought the shovels at every depth. Ison had placed this one 600 paces southeast of the second, in a spot where the terrain dipped toward a shallow ravine. The indicators were weaker here. Only 1 camel thorn bush instead of 3. A faint moisture gradient in the evening sand. But the geometry of the water table demanded a 3rd point at this distance to create a triangulated supply that would not overtax any single source. He explained none of this to the diggers. He simply marked the spot and said, dig. By the 4th day without water, Yunbora threw her shovel out of the hole and climbed out, and stood in front of him with her arms crossed. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her face said it all. He looked past her into the hole where the 2 young men had stopped digging and were leaning on their shovels, waiting for someone to tell them to stop. Ison asked for 1 more day. Bora held his gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she climbed back down and picked up the shovel. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the sand turned dark and wet, and water seeped into the bottom of the shaft, and Ison exhaled a breath he had been holding for 2 days. 3 wells, 3 for 3. The triangle was complete. Now the real work began. Ison spent 2 days walking the lines between the wells, measuring the precise gradient of the ground. The slope was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A drop of maybe 1 chi over every 100 paces, running from the 3rd well northwest to the 1st. That meant water would flow by gravity if the channels were dug correctly. No pumps, no buckets, no hauling, just the patient pull of the earth itself. He marked the channel lines with small stone cairns every 20 paces and assigned the digging in shifts. 2 people on the channels, 2 on widening and reinforcing the wells with stone linings to prevent collapse, 2 on gathering clay from the southern hills for lining the channels, 2 on food preparation and maintaining the camp. He rotated them every 2 days so no one burned out on the hardest tasks. This was not generosity. This was resource management. These 8 people were his only workforce. If one of them broke a leg or collapsed from heat exhaustion, the entire project timeline would stretch by weeks he could not afford. The clay was a problem. The deposit at the base of the southern hills was accessible, but the quality was inconsistent. Some layers were dense and workable. Others were silty and would crack when dried. Ison showed them how to test each batch by rolling a thin rope of clay around a finger. If it held without cracking, the clay was good. If it broke, the silt content was too high, and they needed to dig deeper. Pak Min-hoo's granddaughter, Pak Soa, followed him during these trips. She was 19, with quick eyes and a habit of talking too much. She asked why the clay in one spot was different from clay 10 paces away. Ison started to say something about sedimentary deposition rates, and then stopped. He thought for a moment. Then he said that water sorts things by weight. Heavy things sink first, and light things travel further. So clay near the hill is purer because the heavy clay particles settled first, while the lighter silt washed further out. Soa nodded and asked if that was why the sand in different parts of Somak was different colors. Ison looked at her. It was a sharp question, sharper than he expected. He said yes. He said the color of sand tells you what minerals are in it, and the minerals tell you what the soil can and cannot do. Soa asked if he could teach her to read sand the way he did. He said he could try. She pulled out a small bound notebook from inside her jacket. She had been carrying it the whole time. She had been writing down everything he said since day 1. He had not noticed. That bothered him. He should have noticed. 2 weeks in. The first channel connecting well 1 to well 2 was complete. Ison had them fill it slowly. Water crept along the clay-lined trench at a walking pace. It reached the second well basin without a single leak. The system worked. He allowed himself 1 moment of satisfaction. 1 heartbeat of standing there, watching water flow through a channel he had designed on the back of a land deed with a piece of charcoal. Then he started thinking about the next problem. They needed a planting bed. He had identified a depression between the first and second wells that was naturally sheltered from the northwest wind by a low rise of compacted sand. The soil there was less saline than the surrounding ground. Still too salty for most crops, but within range of what could be reclaimed. The process was simple in theory. Flood the bed, let the water dissolve the surface salts. Drain the water, carrying the dissolved salts away. Repeat 4 or 5 cycles, and the salt concentration would drop below the threshold for barley. In practice, it required a drainage channel to carry the saline water away from the planting area so it did not just soak back in. More digging, more clay lining, more days. He pushed them hard, not cruelly. He worked alongside them from dawn to dark and dug as much as anyone. But he pushed the pace because he was counting days in his head, and the numbers were not comfortable. They had arrived in what seemed to be early spring. The growing season was short in this climate. If they did not get barley seed in the ground within 6 weeks, the crop would not mature before the cold came. And if they had no harvest, they had no food and no seed for next year, and the entire project would die in its first winter. He explained this to Pak Min-hoo one evening while they sat by the first well eating the last of their dried fish. The old man listened and nodded slowly. He said he understood. Then he asked where they would get seed. Ison had been thinking about this. The nearest settlement was the Uez town of Haryong, 20 li to the west. They had been getting water from a stream near there. The town had a market, but Ison had no money. The chest his brothers had sent contained the family seal and the land deed and 3 copper coins. 3. Not enough to buy a single bag of barley seed. Pak Min-hoo said there was another way. He said the town of Haryong was struggling too. The drought had cut their harvest by half, and the local magistrate was desperate for anything that might help. If Ison could offer something in trade, something valuable. Ison asked what they had to trade. Pak Min-hoo said nothing. Then he looked at the well and looked back at Ison and said, maybe not nothing. The next morning, Ison walked to Haryong. 6 hours across sand and scrub with a water skin and a walking stick. The town was small, maybe 300 people. Mud walls, thatched roofs, a single market street with a dozen stalls selling dried goods and rough cloth. The well in the center of town was low. Ison could see it from the way people rationed their buckets. They were not desperate yet, but they could see desperation from where they stood. He found the magistrate's office. Ison spent the rest of the day walking the terrain around Haryong. He read the ground the way he always did: vegetation patterns, soil color, insect behavior, surface moisture gradients, topography. By evening, he had identified a spot 800 paces north of town, where a subtle fold in the terrain suggested a buried channel, an ancient streambed, perhaps, filled with gravel and sand. The perfect conduit for groundwater moving down from the hills. He marked the spot with a cairn. The next morning, 4 of the magistrate's men came with shovels and skeptical faces. They dug. Ison supervised. He adjusted the angle of the shaft twice based on what the removed soil told him about the substrate layers. At the end of the second day, they hit gravel, wet gravel. Water welled up fast, faster than any of his Somak wells. A strong flow, clean and cold. The magistrate came to see for himself. He stood at the edge and looked down at the water rising in the shaft, and his face went through several expressions that he tried to hide and failed. He turned to Ison and asked how. Ison said the water was always there. They just did not know where to look. The magistrate was quiet for a while. Then he said the seed would be delivered to Somak within 3 days, and he asked if Ison might be willing to come back and find them one more well. Ison returned to Somak with a promise and sore feet. Pak Min-hu met him at the edge of the settlement and saw his face and knew. The old man did not smile. He was not a man who smiled easily. But he nodded in a way that contained a smile somewhere deep inside it. That evening, Ison sat alone on the dune where the cart had first dropped him and looked out over his land in the fading light. 3 wells. 1 channel. A planting bed being prepared. Seed coming in 3 days. It was almost nothing. A fingernail scratch on the surface of a problem the size of a continent. But it was real. The water was real. The channel was real. The salt was leaving the soil 1 flood cycle at a time. He could see it. He could measure it. He could count it. And that was enough. For now, that was enough. The seed arrived on the 4th day, not the 3rd. Ison had expected that. A promise kept late is still a promise in a drought. 2 bags of barley seed and 1 small bag of dried beans, delivered by a young clerk from Haryong, who looked around Somak with an expression of horrified pity and left as fast as his mule could carry him. Ison did not care about the expression. He cared about the seeds. He opened the barley bag and took a handful and examined them. Decent quality, not great. Some were undersized, and a few showed signs of fungal spotting. He sorted through both bags that evening by lamplight, removing damaged seeds, grading the rest by size. Soa sat beside him and helped without being asked. She learned the sorting criteria after watching for 10 minutes, and her hands were faster than his. They worked until midnight. When they finished, they had enough clean seed for a 1/4 hectare of barley and a small plot of beans, half what he had asked for. The magistrate had been generous, but he could not give what his own town might need. Ison adjusted his calculations. A 1/4 hectare would yield maybe 150 kilograms of barley if conditions were favorable. Enough to feed 10 people for 2 months. Not enough for a year. He would need a second planting in autumn if the soil held. He would need the bean crop to supplement. He would need to forage. He would need luck. He hated relying on luck. Luck was the one variable you could not engineer. Planting day was quiet. No ceremony. No speeches. Ison showed them how to space the seeds. 3 fingers apart in rows the width of a forearm. Not the local method of scattering handfuls and hoping. Precision planting meant every seed had enough soil and water and light to maximize its yield. He showed them how to press each seed to the correct depth. Too shallow, and birds would eat them. Too deep, and the sprout would exhaust itself before reaching sunlight. Pak Min-hoo watched this with the expression of a man seeing familiar things done in an unfamiliar way. He had planted barley before. Everyone here had. But not like this. Not with this obsessive attention to spacing and depth and orientation. Ison planted the first row himself, kneeling in the dirt, pressing each seed into place with his thumb. His back ached by the end of the first row. This body was still weak. He kept going. Soa planted beside him. Her rows were straighter than his. She had steady hands. 10 days after planting, nothing. The bed was dark and moist and silent. Ison checked the soil moisture twice a day. The salt levels were dropping with each irrigation cycle. The temperature was right. The seed quality was adequate. Everything was within parameters. But seeds do not read parameters. Seeds do what they do in their own time, and no amount of engineering can make them hurry. Yunbora asked on the 8th day whether they should plant more, in case these did not take. Ison said no. If these seeds failed, it meant the soil conditions were wrong, and planting more of the same would waste seed. Better to wait, diagnose, adjust. She did not like this answer. He could see that. She was a woman of action. Waiting was not in her nature, but she did not argue. She went back to hauling clay from the hills. She did this every day without complaint. He noticed that. He noticed everything. The way Pak Min-hoo's limp was worse in the mornings. The way the two young men whose names were Jang Wook and Jang Pil-soo worked better when they were on the same shift. The way the child whose name was Dole was always hungry and always trying to hide it. The way Soa checked the planting bed every morning before anyone was awake and came back with either a neutral face or a worried one. On the 11th morning, she came back running. She did not say anything. She just grabbed his sleeve and pulled. He followed her to the field. The first shoots were breaking through. Pale green threads pushing up through dark soil. Maybe 30 of them, scattered across the bed like scattered stars. Ison knelt and looked at them. They were thin, fragile. A strong wind could flatten them, but they were alive, growing, in sand that 6 weeks ago had been a salt crust where nothing had lived for decades. Soa was breathing fast beside him. She asked if this meant it was working. He said yes. This meant it was working. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, and she sat down in the dirt next to the field and just stared at the green shoots as if she had never seen anything so impossible in her life. The barley grew, every day a little taller, every day a little more convincing. Ison checked the field each morning and each evening, measuring growth rates by eye and estimating biomass and adjusting the irrigation schedule by fractions. Too much water one day, he reduced the flow. A slight yellowing on the leaf tips suggested nitrogen deficiency. The bean plants were too young to fix meaningful nitrogen yet, so he had Soa collect beetle dung from the dune bases and work it into the soil around the weakest plants. Crude, but effective, organic nitrogen source. Professor Choi would have laughed at the method and then approved the results. The yellowing stopped within a week. On the 42nd day, a man arrived on a thin horse. He wore the robe of a minor official, clean but not new. His face was narrow, and his eyes were the kind that recorded everything and gave nothing back. He dismounted and bowed to Ison with a precision that felt rehearsed. He said his name was Kim Do-soo. He said he had been appointed by the family of Chon as managing steward of the Somak estate. He presented a sealed letter from Chon Hosok confirming the appointment. Ison read the letter. It was polite and brief and explained that a proper estate required proper administration and that Kim Do-soo was an experienced clerk who would handle accounts and correspondence and tax filings. The subtext was loud enough to read from across the room. This was a spy. His brothers had sent someone to watch him, to document his failures, to report back how the foolish fourth son was wasting his inheritance in the sand. Ison folded the letter and handed it back and welcomed Kim Do-soo to Somak. He showed him the settlement. settlement, the 3 wells, the irrigation channels, the barley field now knee-high and green. Kim Doo-soo looked at all of it with an expression of professional blankness. He said nothing about the water or the crops. He asked about the tax records. Ison said there were no tax records. There had been nothing to tax. Kim Doo-soo nodded and wrote something in a small ledger he carried in his sleeve. Ison watched the brush move and thought about what would be in the first report to Chon Hosok. Probably that the 4th brother was playing farmer in the sand. Probably that it was all very quaint and doomed. The barley reached waist height by the 60th day, and Ison began to think about expansion. The first field had proven the concept. The soil could be reclaimed. Crops could grow, but a 1/4 hectare would not sustain them through winter, let alone support growth. He needed more land, more water, more people. The water he could find, the land he could prepare, but people were the constraint. 8 adults and 1 child could only dig so many channels and prepare so many beds. He needed labor. The question was where to find it. Pak Min-hoo provided the answer without meaning to. One evening, the old man mentioned that there were villages to the south. Small clusters of families, scratching survival from increasingly barren land. Most were losing people every year. Young men leaving for the cities, old people dying, children growing up with nothing. The drought was squeezing them out. Ison asked how far the nearest village was. Pak Min-hoo said maybe 12 li south along the foothills, a place called Yulmak. Maybe 60 people left. Used to be 300. The rest had scattered over the past 5 years as the wells dried up one by one. Ison decided to go. He walked to Yulmak the next morning, arrived by midday. The village was worse than Sumak had been. At least Sumak had the honesty of being openly dead. Yulmak was dying while pretending to live. The houses were maintained but empty. Gardens fenced but bare. A communal well stood in the center with a bucket on a rope and a line of people waiting, although there were only 9 of them. The water that came up was brown and smelled of iron. Ison watched from the road. A woman was directing the water distribution, tall, weathered, broad across the shoulders, with hands that had done heavy work every day of their lives. She saw him and walked over with the kind of directness that does not ask permission. She asked who he was and what he wanted. He said he was Chon Ison, Lord of Sumak. She almost laughed. She said Sumak was dead land. He said it was not dead anymore. She looked at him for a long time. Her name was So Yeonhwa. She was the village leader, 26 years old. She had taken over after her father died on corvée labor for the provincial lord 3 years ago. Since then, she had buried 11 people, 6 from hunger, 3 from illness that hunger made fatal, 2 who walked into the desert and did not come back. She told him this without self-pity, just facts, the way you list the contents of a ledger. She said she had 43 people, old and young, sick and able. She said if he could feed them, she would bring them all, every last one. But she wanted him to understand something first. She stepped close enough that he could see the lines of sun damage around her eyes and the scar on her jaw where something sharp had caught her once. She said if by winter there was no food, she would take her people and leave. She did not care who he was or what his family name was or what his title said. If her people went hungry, she would walk them out and he could have his sand kingdom to himself. Ison looked her in the eye and said he understood. He said he was not asking her to trust him. He was asking her to give him until the first frost. She held his gaze. Then she nodded once, short and final. She said she would be back in 4 days with everyone who could walk. She arrived in 3. 43 people, old women carrying bundles on their backs, young men hauling a cart of tools, children clinging to their mothers, a pregnant woman riding a donkey. They came down the dune in a ragged line and stopped at the edge of the settlement and looked around at the 3 wells and the channels and the barley field and the 8 people who were already there. Pak Minhu walked forward and bowed to So Yanhua. She bowed back. Neither smiled. They understood each other the way 2 people who have survived the same kind of years always understand each other. Ison now had 51 people, and about 10 weeks of growing season left. He spent the next week in constant motion, marking new well sites, surveying channel routes, testing soil in the new planting areas, teaching the newcomers how to line channels with clay, showing them the irrigation schedule, explaining why the spacing mattered, why the drainage mattered, why every detail mattered. Yanhua shadowed him for the first 3 days. She did not ask why he did things the way he did. She watched. On the 4th day, she began doing the soil tests herself. On the 5th, she corrected one of her own men who was spacing bean seeds too close together. On the 6th, she came to Ison and told him that the clay from the southern hills was running low at the accessible layers, and they would need to dig deeper or find a new source. She had already scouted 2 possible sites. She laid out the options with the precision of an engineer. Ison chose the closer site. She nodded and had a team there by the next morning. Kim Dusu watched all of this from his desk. He wrote in his ledger every day. Sometimes he walked the settlement and counted things. People, wells, channels, rows of barley. He never offered to help. He never asked questions about the work. He asked questions about the expenses. What was the cost of seed? How much clay was consumed? What was the estimated yield? How many man-hours per channel meter? Ison answered honestly. He had nothing to hide. The numbers were modest. The work was hard. There was no secret wealth or forbidden magic here. Just people digging dirt and planting seeds and hoping the water would hold. Kim Dusu wrote it all down in characters so small and precise they looked like insect tracks. He dispatched a letter to the provincial capital every 10 days by a runner hired from Haryong. Ison led him. The reports would be accurate and damning by the standards of anyone who measured success in gold or power. A tiny settlement, a single field of barley, a few holes in the ground full of water. Chon Hosok would read these reports and see nothing worth worrying about. That was exactly what Ison wanted him to see. The barley harvest came on the 87th day. The heads were full and golden and heavy, and they bent the stalks in the morning breeze like a field of small bowing figures. Ison cut the first stalk himself. He held it up and stripped the grains into his palm. They were smaller than he would have liked. The second planting went in 2 days after the harvest. Ison reserved 30 kilograms of the best barley seed. He allocated the remainder for food on a strict rationing schedule that Yanhua managed with the same precision she applied to everything else. She calculated daily portions per person, adjusted for body weight and labor intensity. Heavy diggers got more. Children got more relative to their size. She enforced these allocations without favoritism and without exceptions. When one of the young men from her village tried to take an extra portion for his pregnant wife, Yanhua gave the wife a full portion from the childcare allocation and docked the man's ration for 2 days. The man complained. Yanhua told him that if he had asked instead of stealing, she would have given it freely. The man did not steal again. Nobody did. Ison expanded the planting area to a full hectare, more than double the first field. The new beds needed the same salt washing treatment, but the process was faster now. They had more water, more channels, more hands. The bean harvest from the first planting was small but valuable, 20 kilograms of dried beans. More importantly, the bean roots had left nitrogen nodules in the soil. Ison dug up several plants and showed Soa the small white lumps clinging to the roots. He said these were tiny factories. They took something from the air and put it in the soil. And that something was what made plants grow strong and green. Soa wrote this down. She asked what the something was called. Ison hesitated. In this language, there was no word for nitrogen. He said it was called life breath of the soil. Soa wrote that down too. Then she crossed it out and wrote a single character beside it. She had invented her own shorthand. She was building a vocabulary for concepts that did not exist in this world. He watched her do this and felt a strange mix of pride and unease. He was planting ideas in her the same way he planted barley in the sand. And ideas once planted grew in directions you could not always predict. The autumn planting was barely in the ground when the first real test arrived. Not drought, not hunger, violence. A group of riders appeared on the northern dunes one morning. 12 men on rough horses with leather armor and short swords. Bandits. Common enough in the border territories where law was thin and desperation thick, they had likely heard about the settlement through travelers, or the Haryong trade route. A new settlement with water and food and no garrison was an easy target. Ison saw them from the field, where he was adjusting an irrigation gate. His stomach dropped. He had known this would happen eventually. He had planned for it in the abstract. But abstract plans do not account for the way your hands shake when you see armed men riding toward everything you have built. Pak Min-hoo rang the old bronze bell by the granary, the signal they had agreed on. Everyone dropped their tools and moved to the central area between the wells. 51 people, no weapons, shovels and hose and clay-lined buckets. Ison walked to the front of the group. His mind was racing through options. Fight was suicide. They had no training and no arms. Flee meant abandoning the wells and the crops and starting over from nothing. He had to talk. He hated that talking was his only option, but it was. The riders stopped 20 paces away. Their leader was a thick-necked man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. He looked at the settlement with an expression of amused contempt. He said they were claiming this territory for their band. He said the people could leave or they could stay and pay tribute. Half of everything. Grain, water, tools, monthly. Or they could fight. And he gestured at his men and laughed. And the laugh was not kind. Ison stepped forward. He was aware of every eye on him, his people behind, the riders ahead. He said he had a counter-offer. He said he could find water. He pointed at the wells. He said these wells were the first of many. He said the bandits' own territory to the north was dry. He knew this because they were here. If they had water at home, they would not be raiding a settlement of farmers. He said if the bandit leader gave him 3 days, he would find him a well site in his own territory. Free water, no fighting, no tribute, just water. The bandit leader stared at him. The amusement faded from his face and was replaced by something more dangerous: calculation. He said, why should he wait 3 days when he could just take everything now? Ison said because everything here was worth maybe 2 months of food. A well in the bandits' own territory would be worth a lifetime of water. He was offering a permanent solution to a problem the bandit leader had been living with for years. The riders could drink from that well for generations. Or they could take a few bags of grain and come back in 3 months to an empty ruin because Ison and his people would be dead or gone, and nobody else would be coming to fill the stores. There was a long silence. The wind blew sand against the horse's legs. One of the riders shifted in his saddle and his leather creaked. The leader chewed on something and spat on the ground. Then he said 3 days. If Ison was lying, he would come back and take everything, including fingers. He turned his horse and the riders followed, and they disappeared over the dunes. Ison's knees went weak. He locked them straight and did not let anyone see. Yanhua came to his side and said in a low voice that he was either very smart or very stupid. Ison said he would find out in 3 days. He spent those 3 days in the hills north of Somak, walking, reading, looking. The terrain was different here, rockier. The water table would be deeper, but the geology was favorable. A layer of limestone beneath the surface sandstone would channel water along its upper surface, creating springs where the limestone met a fault or fracture. He found what he was looking for on the second day, a dry wash, a seasonal streambed that cut through a limestone ridge. At the base of the ridge, the rock was stained dark, mineral deposits from evaporated water, seepage. Not active now, but it meant water had flowed here recently enough to leave marks. He traced the line of the wash uphill and found a fracture in the limestone at the head of a small valley. This was the spot. He marked it and went back. The bandits returned on the third morning. Same 12 riders, same leader with the scar. Ison met them at the edge of the settlement and said he had found the spot. He offered to lead them there. The leader considered this. Then he nodded and told 4 of his men to stay behind as insurance. 4 armed men sitting on horses beside the granary, while Ison led the rest north into the hills. Behind him, the settlement held its breath. Yanhua stood in the center of it with a shovel in her hands and murder in her eyes. The ride took 2 hours. Ison pointed to the marked spot at the base of the limestone ridge. The bandit leader looked at the bare rock and dry gravel, and his expression said this had better not be a joke. Ison described what he saw: the mineral staining, the fracture pattern, the limestone channel beneath the surface. The leader understood none of it. He understood the tone, the certainty, the same certainty that had convinced Pak Min-hu and the magistrate of Haryong. He told his men to dig. They dug with swords and hands and rocks because they had no shovels. Ison told them where to angle the cut and how deep to go. By late afternoon, they were 8 chi down in crumbling limestone. Then the rock cracked. Water sprayed from the fracture in a cold jet that soaked 2 of the men before they could scramble back. Not a seep, a spring. Pressurized groundwater trapped behind the limestone cap. The flow was strong, easily 100 liters per hour. The bandit leader stood at the edge of the hole and watched the water pool at the bottom. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he looked at Ison and said he had a deal. No tribute, no raids, not on Somak. He said this once, and he did not repeat it, and his tone made it clear this was the only time he would say it. He turned and mounted his horse, and his men followed. The 4 guards left the settlement that evening without incident. That night, Ison sat by the first well, and his hands would not stop shaking. Yanhua found him there. She sat beside him. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said he had been afraid. It was not a question. He said yes. She said she could not tell. He said that was the point. She was quiet again. Then she said that what he had done was not what lords do. Lords send soldiers. They build walls. They fight. He had given water to the people who came to rob him. She did not say whether she thought this was good or bad. She just said it was not what lords do. Ison said he was not a lord. He was a man who understood dirt. She looked at him. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not softness. Yanhua did not do softness. Something more like recognition. She stood and left without another word. But from that night on, she stopped calling him Lord. She called him by his name. The autumn progressed. The second barley crop grew more slowly than the first. Shorter days, cooler temperatures, but the soil was better. The first planting in the bean rotation had improved the structure. The salt levels were lower, the nitrogen was higher. Ison measured these changes with methods that looked like sorcery to everyone watching. He tasted the soil. He rubbed it between his fingers. He mixed it with water in a clay pot and watched how fast the particles settled. Heavy sand first, then silt, then clay. The layers told him the soil composition with rough accuracy. He compared samples from different areas. The treated beds were visibly different from untreated ground, darker, finer, more cohesive, soil that was starting to become soil instead of sand. This was the part that thrilled him in a way he could never explain to anyone here. Not the water, not the crops, the soil itself. The transformation of dead mineral substrate into living earth, a process that in nature takes centuries and that he was compressing into months through the application of principles he had spent his old life learning. He was doing what he had spent years theorizing about in papers and presentations and grant proposals, actually doing it with his hands in the ground. And it was working. But the triumph of the soil was tempered by a harder truth. Winter was coming, and winter in a desert is not the gentle cold of temperate lands. It is a killing cold that strikes fast and without mercy. Frost can destroy a crop overnight. Wind can tear through shelters and steal warmth from sleeping bodies in hours. Ison had read about desert winters in his old life. He had never lived through one. Not like this. Not with 51 people depending on him. He began winter preparations in earnest. Thicker walls for the shelters, using a technique he adapted from rammed earth construction. 2 layers of packed clay with dried brush insulation between them. Windbreaks along the northwest edge of the settlement. Storage pits for grain lined with clay to keep moisture and vermin out. A covered channel to prevent the irrigation water from freezing in the coldest hours. Every preparation was a race against the calendar, and they were losing. The first frost came 3 weeks earlier than he expected. He woke before dawn to a world rimed white. Ice crystals on the barley heads. Ice in the irrigation channels. His breath hung in the air in thick clouds. He ran to the field. The barley was still standing. Stiff with frost, but standing. He checked the heads. The grain was hard and dry, close to mature. If the frost stayed mild, they might still harvest. If it deepened, the grain would shatter in the husks. He had maybe 5 days. He made the call. Harvest now. Take what they could, sacrifice the remaining growth for certainty. Yanhua mobilized everyone within the hour. They cut through the morning with numb fingers and clouded breath. By afternoon, they had cleared the field. The yield was lower than the first harvest, 109 kilograms. The grain was smaller, less developed, but it was grain. Added to the reserves from the first harvest and the bean stalks, they had enough food for 3 months of careful rationing. Winter would last 5. There was a gap, a dangerous one. Ison stared at the numbers and saw the gap like a crevasse in his plans. 2 months of shortfall, 60 days of hunger that no amount of irrigation or soil science could fill. He needed another source of food, or he would lose people before spring. And losing people meant losing everything. Winter hit Somak like a closed fist. The temperature dropped to levels that turned the irrigation channels into ribbons of ice and made the sand hard as fired clay. The wind came from the northwest, as Ison had predicted, but he had underestimated its ferocity. At night, it screamed through the settlement, rattling the shelters and driving grit through every crack and seam. The rammed earth walls held, but the roofs were weak. 3 shelters lost their thatch in the first week. Ison redesigned the roof anchoring system using a lattice of bound thorn branches weighted with stones. Crude, but it worked. The wind would tear at the thatch and the lattice would hold, and the stones would groan but not give. He made this fix sound simple, but it cost 2 days of labor in freezing conditions, and by the end of it, 3 workers had frostbitten fingers, and Ison himself could barely close his hands. The food situation dominated everything. Yanhua ran the rationing with an iron will. 2 meals a day, barley porridge in the morning, bean soup with dried greens in the evening. The portions were calculated to sustain life, not comfort, not strength, just the minimum to keep a body functioning in cold conditions. Children received extra, but even their portions were small enough that the youngest ones cried at night from hunger. Ison heard the crying through the walls, and it kept him awake in ways the wind never could. He had to find more food. The hills to the south were not entirely barren. Even in winter, certain plants survived. He took Soa and 2 of the Yulmok men and spent 4 days foraging in the foothills. They found roots, tough, fibrous things that tasted like wood and required hours of boiling to become chewable, but they were calories. They found a stand of winter sedge near a frozen seep. The stalks were edible after drying and grinding. More calories. They found animal tracks, small rodents burrowing in the rocky soil. Soa set snares, using techniques Pak Min-hu taught her. By the end of the week, they had a small supplement to the daily rations. Not enough to close the gap, but enough to keep the worst at bay. On the 32nd day of winter, a woman named No Jin-so died. She was 61, one of Yeonhwa's people from Yulmok. She had been sick since before the move, a cough that would not clear. The cold finished what the cough had started. She died in her sleep under a pile of blankets that were not enough. Yeonhwa found her in the morning and stood at the door of the shelter for a long time before she went to tell the others. They buried her that afternoon in the frozen ground east of the settlement. The grave was shallow because the ground was hard and the living did not have the strength to dig deep for the dead. Yeonhwa said the words that needed saying, short and plain. She said No Jin-so had survived 2 famines and a flood and 20 years of bad harvests. She said the old woman deserved better than a frozen hole in a desert. Then she picked up the shovel and filled the grave herself, and nobody tried to help because they understood that she needed to do this alone. Ison stood at the edge of the burial and felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a physical load. This was his settlement, his project, his plan, and a woman had died in it because he had not prepared well enough for winter. He could list the reasons: the early frost, the insufficient stores, the impossibility of building a fully provisioned settlement in 5 months from nothing. All true, all irrelevant. She was dead. The reasons did not matter to her. That evening, he sat in his shelter and stared at the wall and let himself feel the full measure of it. Then he stood up and went to check the irrigation channels for ice blockages because the barley stubble in the field needed to be watered even in winter to prevent the soil from reverting to salt crust. And if he stopped working, the soil would die. And if the soil died, then more people would follow No Jin-so into the frozen ground. 45th day of winter. A stranger arrived. Not a bandit, not a traitor, a woman. Alone on foot, with a pack on her back and a walking staff, and the look of someone who has been moving for a long time. She came from the east, through the deep desert, a path nobody took because nobody survived it. She walked into the settlement at midday and sat down by the first well and drank water for 5 minutes straight without stopping. When she finally looked up, Ison was standing in front of her. She was young, maybe 28, long dark hair matted with sand and tied back with a strip of cloth. Her clothes were simple, traveler's garb, dusty and worn. But her pack was heavy, with jars and bundles and pouches that clinked when she set it down. She said her name was Yun Herin. She said she was a herbalist. She said she had heard there was a settlement in the waste that had water, and she had nowhere else to go. She said this simply and without drama, as if arriving from the deep desert alone in the dead of winter was the most ordinary thing in the world. Ison asked where she had come from. She said from Gwanghan, a town in the next province east. She had been a healer there. Her husband had died 2 years ago and left her his debts. The creditors took her house, then her workshop, then her supplies. She fled before they could take her freedom. She had been moving ever since, living on what she could gather and trade. When she heard rumors of a place in the western desert that had water, she started walking. 3 weeks across the waste. She ran out of water on the 4th day and survived on condensation collected from rocks at dawn and the juice of succulents she found growing in crevices. Ison listened to this and felt something he had not felt in months: admiration. 3 weeks in the deep desert with no water source. That required a combination of knowledge and will that most people did not possess. He gave her a shelter, a small one, vacated by consolidation. The single and elderly residents had doubled up for warmth at Yeonhwa's suggestion, and there was one empty building, Hedin unpacked her jars, and within a day, her shelter smelled of herbs and minerals and things Ison could not identify. She made herself useful immediately. She examined the workers with frost-bitten fingers and prepared a salve from rendered fat and a plant extract she carried with her. The swelling reduced within 2 days. She looked at the children and identified 3 with early signs of scurvy before Ison had noticed. She prepared a tea from pine needles gathered in the southern hills. Vitamin C. Ison recognized the treatment. Different culture, different continent, same science. He watched her work and saw someone who understood the natural world the way he did, not through mysticism or tradition alone, but through observation and experiment and accumulated knowledge. A kindred mind in an alien world. On the 48th day of winter, Yanhua came to him and said they had a problem. She said the food was running out faster than calculated, not because anyone was stealing, because the cold was worse than expected, and bodies were burning more energy to stay warm. Her revised calculations showed they would run out of grain 12 days before the projected end of winter. 12 days of nothing. She said this in the flat tone she used for news she had already processed and accepted. Ison closed his eyes. 12 days. In full winter conditions, with no supplement. Children would suffer first, then the elderly, then everyone else. He asked what she recommended. She said they could reduce portions now and spread the shortage over more days, thinner but longer. Or they could maintain current portions and face 12 days of total deprivation at the end. Neither option was good. Ison said there was a third option. She waited. He had been thinking about the frozen seep in the southern hills, the one where they had found the winter sedge. A frozen seep meant water under pressure trapped by ice. If the water was flowing underneath the frozen surface, it meant there was an aquifer feeding it from the hills, a winter aquifer, active even in cold months. Deeper than the surface frost layer. If he could tap it, he could create a water source that did not freeze. And if he had flowing water in winter, he could build a small, heated greenhouse. Not with glass, with oiled cloth stretched over a frame, translucent enough to pass light. The water from a warm aquifer would provide radiant heat. He could grow cold-tolerant greens, turnips, radishes, things that matured in 30 to 40 days, even in low light. It was not proven. He had never tried it. In his old life, greenhouses used manufactured materials and engineered heating systems. Here, he would be working with sticks and cloth and hope. But the alternative was watching people starve. He took Jang Wook and Jang Pil-su and went south. They spent 2 days at the seep. Ison examined the ice. He broke through the surface layer and found what he expected. Flowing water beneath. Not fast, but steady. And warm. Relatively warm. The water was maybe 8 or 9 degrees, coming from deep enough that the seasonal cold did not reach it. He traced the flow. It ran along a rocky shelf just below the surface, moving west toward the basin. This was a different water system from the wells. Those tapped a still aquifer. This was a spring-fed channel, moving water, constant temperature. He could work with this. He marked a spot where the channel was closest to the surface and where the terrain provided natural wind shelter from a rock outcrop. They dug, carefully, through ice and frozen soil and then through gravel to the water-bearing layer. The water welled up into their trench and steamed faintly in the cold air, warm, alive. Even the brothers stopped and stared. Back in Somak, Ison designed the greenhouse, a frame of bound thorn branches, walls of oiled cloth from torn clothing soaked in rendered fat. Not ideal, not even close, but functional. He dug a shallow channel through the center of the structure and connected it to the warm spring via a clay-lined trench. The warm water flowed through the greenhouse floor. The heat rose. The oiled cloth trapped it. Inside, the temperature was maybe 15 degrees warmer than outside. Still cold by farming standards, but enough for turnips and radish and winter lettuce. He planted on the 51st day of winter. The seeds came from Hedin. She carried vegetable seeds in her pack. As a healer who understood that food was medicine, she gave them without hesitation. Ison planted them in raised beds along the warm water channel and covered them with a layer of straw mulch and waited. The greens sprouted on the 59th day, 8 days, fast for winter conditions. The warm water and the trapped heat were working. The turnip shoots were pale and thin, but they were growing. The radish was slower, but breaking through. Ison adjusted the water flow to maintain temperature and prevent flooding. He added a second layer of oiled cloth to the walls where the wind hit hardest. Heron brought more herbs from her dwindling supply and suggested interplanting aromatic herbs between the vegetables to deter the small rodents that had found the greenhouse. Ison agreed. Her knowledge of plants complemented his knowledge of soil and water in ways that made the whole system stronger. The first turnips were ready on the 75th day. Small, pale, not much bigger than a fist, but crisp and sweet from the cold growing conditions and absolutely real. Hedin pulled the first one from the soil and held it up and looked at it, and then looked at Ison and said quietly that in all her years of healing, she had never seen anyone grow food in winter in a desert. Ison said it was not magic. It was plumbing and cloth. She said she knew. She said that was what made it remarkable. That evening, the turnips were added to the soup pot. Everyone got a piece, even the smallest children. The taste was sharp and earthy and alive. Old Pak Min Hu ate his slowly, with his eyes closed. When he finished, he opened his eyes and looked at the greenhouse, glowing faintly with lamplight against the dark winter sky, and said nothing. But he sat there, looking at it, for a long time after everyone else had gone to sleep. The greenhouse did not close the gap entirely. The yields were too small and the growing cycle too slow to replace the grain shortfall fully, but it softened the blow. Instead of 12 days with nothing, they faced 12 days of reduced rations supplemented by fresh vegetables. Thin days, hard days, but survivable. Yunhua recalculated the projections and confirmed they would make it, barely, with nothing to spare, but they would make it. She told Ison this in the same flat tone she used for everything. But this time, the flatness was a lid on something that was trying very hard to get out. On the 83rd day of winter, Kim Dusu asked to speak with Ison privately. They sat in Ison's shelter by lamplight. Kim Dusu placed his ledger on the table and opened it to a page covered in figures. He said he had been keeping accurate records of everything. Every grain of barley, every bucket of water, every labor hour, every death. He paused on the word death. Then he said that in his experience as a clerk for 4 noble houses, he had never seen an estate operate with this degree of precision on this small a margin. He said most lords would have abandoned sumac after the first month. He said most lords would not have known what a salt wash was. He did not ask how Ison knew. He simply stated the observation and closed the ledger and waited. Ison studied him, the narrow face, the recording eyes. He asked what Kim Dusu planned to write in his next report to Chon Hosok. Kim Dusu was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would write what he always wrote. The truth. That Somak was a minor estate with a small population and modest harvests, and an unusual lord who talked to dirt. Ison understood. The truth that Kim Dusu chose to tell was a truth that contained no threat, a truth that would keep Chon Hosok uninterested for another season. It was not loyalty. It was something more complicated. A clerk's professional respect for a system that worked. A small, invisible alliance built on numbers in a ledger. Ison nodded. Kim Dusu nodded. Neither said thank you. Neither needed to. Han So-yun spent her first day counting. She counted people, she counted wells, she counted shelters, she counted the rows of stubble in the harvested field, and the jars of stored grain in the granary, and the tools hanging on the wall of the workshop. She wrote each number in a ledger, with characters so precise they looked printed. She did not speak to Ison during this process. She did not ask questions. She simply moved through the settlement with her counting frame clicking, and her spectacles catching the light, and her brush moving across paper in a rhythm that never paused. Kim Do-soo watched her from his desk, with the expression of a man who has met a superior predator. He had been the most meticulous person in Somak until this morning. That title had been taken from him in the time it took Han So-yun to count the nails in the granary door. On the second day, she requested a formal meeting. Ison met her in the main building, which he had cleared of bedding and tools for the occasion. So-yun sat across the table from him and opened her leather case and withdrew a stack of forms. Each form was printed on heavy paper with the imperial seal at the top, and dozens of empty boxes arranged in columns so dense they made Ison's eyes hurt. She said she was conducting a standard assessment of a newly active estate. She said the Imperial Revenue Code required all titled land to be assessed within 1 year of productive use commencing. She said productive use was defined as any agricultural or commercial output exceeding 50 kogu of equivalent grain. Ison asked what 50 kogu translated to in kilograms. She told him. He calculated in his head. Their total output was below the threshold, just barely. So-yun looked at him over her spectacles and said she was aware of that. She said she was also aware that the estate was on an upward trajectory and would almost certainly exceed the threshold within the coming season. She said she had 2 options. She could file a preliminary assessment now and return in 6 months for a full evaluation, or she could defer the assessment entirely for 1 year. The first option meant Somak would be on the Imperial Revenue Register immediately, subject to taxation, subject to inspection, subject to the full apparatus of imperial administration. The second option meant 1 more year of invisibility. Ison studied her face. The spectacles made her eyes look larger than they were. Behind the lenses, her gaze was steady and analytical, and completely unreadable. He asked why she was offering a choice. Assessors did not normally offer choices. They assessed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had read Kim Do-soo's reports. All of them. The Imperial Inspectorate received copies of all estate correspondence that passed through provincial relay stations. She had read about the wells, the irrigation, the salt washing, the barley, the greenhouse. She said she had never encountered an estate administration that documented water table depth and soil salinity alongside standard crop yields. She said the methodology was unlike anything in her experience. She paused. Then she said she wanted to understand it. Ison looked at her for a long time. Then he pulled out his working notes. The back of the land deed covered in charcoal diagrams, sheets of rough paper filled with soil test results and water flow calculations and planting schedules. He spread them on the table and began to explain. He talked for 3 hours. He started with the water cycle, how rain falls on the hills and percolates through rock and sand and collects in underground reservoirs. How those reservoirs can be tapped with wells placed at specific points determined by surface indicators. How the water can be moved through channels using gravity alone if the gradient is correctly calculated. He explained the salt washing process, why saline soil cannot grow crops, and how flooding and draining removes the salt layer by layer. He explained nitrogen fixation through legume cultivation, crop rotation, soil structure improvement. The relationship between organic matter and water retention. He drew diagrams, cross-sections of the aquifer, plan views of the channel network, growth curves for barley under different irrigation schedules. So-yun listened without interrupting. Her brush moved across paper constantly, not copying his diagrams, but translating them into her own notation, her own system of recording information that she had clearly developed over years of inspecting things that other people built. When he finished, she sat back and looked at her notes, and then looked at him and said something that surprised him. She said the numbers were beautiful, not the results, the numbers themselves, the relationships between them, the way water flow rates connected to soil salinity, which connected to crop yields, which connected to population sustainability. She said it was like looking at the skeleton of a living thing, every bone in the right place, every joint bearing the right load. Ison felt an unfamiliar sensation, something between recognition and relief. In all the months since he arrived in this world, he had not spoken to anyone who understood what he was doing at a structural level. Pak Minhu understood the results. Yeonhwa understood the logistics. Soa was learning the principles. But Soyeon understood the mathematics, the architecture of the system, the way it all fit together. And she saw beauty in it. He had not expected that. He had not expected to find someone in this world who looked at a gradient calculation and saw beauty. Soyeon deferred the assessment for 1 year. She filed the paperwork that afternoon. Quick, decisive strokes on the imperial forms. She stamped them with her personal seal and placed them in her case, and told Ison she would return in 12 months for the full evaluation. Then she paused at the door. She asked if the settlement had anyone who maintained systematic records of water table levels and soil composition over time. Ison said no. Soa took notes, but there was no formal record-keeping system. Soyeon nodded slowly. She said such records would be valuable, not just for the estate, but for understanding how arid land reclamation works as a repeatable process. She said she would be interested in helping design such a system. If she were to remain in Somak for a time, Ison said she was welcome to stay as long as she wished. She stayed for a month. Then she filed a request with the Imperial Inspectorate for a transfer to the Western District Office in Haryong. She cited the need for closer monitoring of the developing Somak estate. The transfer was approved because nobody else wanted a posting that far from the capital. She moved to Haryong and visited Somak every 3 days, then every 2, then every day. Spring planting expanded the cultivated area to 3 hectares. Ison had spent the winter months planning the layout. 3 new fields arranged in a rotation pattern. Field 1 would grow barley. Field 2 would grow beans and legumes for nitrogen fixation. Field 3 would lie fallow with a cover crop of ryegrass to build soil structure. Each year, the crops would rotate. Barley moved to the bean field. Beans moved to the fallow field. The fallow field became barley. 3-year cycle, continuous improvement. No field would ever be exhausted, because each year it received what the previous crop had taken away. He explained this to Yeonhwa and Soa and Soyeon using sticks and stones arranged on the ground. Yeonhwa grasped it immediately. Soa wrote it all down and asked why ryegrass specifically, and what made it better than just leaving the field empty. Soyeon calculated the projected yield increases over a 5-year period and produced a graph that made Ison stare. She had independently derived the concept of compound soil improvement. The annual gains were small, 2%, 3%, but compounded over years, they were transformative. By year 5, the fields would produce nearly double what they produced in year 1, from the same water, the same labor, just better soil. The new wells went in fast. Ison had mapped the entire basin during his winter walks, and he knew the water table like he knew his own hands. 5 new wells by the end of the first month of spring, 7 by the end of the second, each one placed at the optimal point for both yield and network connectivity. The channel system grew from a simple triangle into a branching network that distributed water to every corner of the cultivated area. Soyeon documented each well, depth, flow rate, water quality. She created a master map of the underground water system that was more accurate than anything Ison could have drawn from memory. She asked him once how he knew where the water was without instruments. He said the instruments were the landscape, the plants, the insects, the soil color, the terrain. Everything you could see with your eyes told you what was happening beneath your feet. You just had to learn the language. She wrote this down. Then she went out and tried to read the landscape herself. She came back 3 hours later with dirt on her spectacles and a dozen observations that were 70% correct. He corrected the other 30%. She adjusted her notes. The next time she went out, her accuracy was 85%. Month 3 of the second year brought 2 events that changed the shape of Somak. The first was small. A family arrived, a father and mother and 2 children from a village 40 li to the north. They had heard about the settlement from a trader passing through Haryang. They walked for 4 days. The father was a potter. He carried his wheel on his back. The mother was a weaver. She carried her loom on the children's backs. They arrived exhausted and dirty and afraid and hopeful in the way that only desperate people can be hopeful. Ison gave them a shelter and a water ration and a plot of land for a garden. The potter set up his wheel that same evening, and by the next morning, he had thrown 6 bowls from local clay. They were rough, unglazed, but functional, and they were the first manufactured goods produced in Somak. Not food, not survival, craft. Something made not because it was needed to live, but because a human being with skills and tools and material will always make things. This was the moment Ison realized that Somak had crossed a line. It was no longer a survival camp. It was becoming a place where people chose to live. The second event was larger. A letter arrived from the provincial capital, carried by an official courier on a fast horse, addressed to Lord Chon Ison of Somak, from the office of Prince Chon Hosok of the House of Chon. The language was formal and elaborate in the way of aristocratic correspondence, but the message was clear. Chon Hosok had heard about the developments in Somak. He congratulated his brother on his industriousness. He expressed interest in visiting the estate. He suggested a date in the coming autumn. The letter was courteous and warm, and every word in it was a threat. Hosok was coming to see what Ison had built, and men like Hosok did not visit things they could not claim. Ison read the letter twice. Then he folded it and placed it in the chest beside the original inheritance documents. He said nothing to anyone about its contents, but that evening he sat at his desk and for the first time began thinking not about soil and water, but about politics, about power, about how to protect what he had built from a brother who owned the law. He started with the maps, Soyeon's water system maps, his own soil surveys, the planting records, the harvest yields, the population register that Kim Do-soo maintained. He gathered every document and every number and began building a case. Not a legal argument, a factual record so detailed and so comprehensive that any attempt to dispute his stewardship would drown in evidence. He remembered a principle from his old life. In Korea's land reform courts, the question was never who owned the land. The question was who used the land. And use was proven by records. Detailed, systematic, undeniable records. He had Soyeon. He had Kim Do-soo. He had every number from every day since he arrived. He began organizing them into a formal registry. Land boundaries, water sources, crop yields per hectare, population by household, tax obligations estimated and projected, investment in infrastructure. It was a mountain of data, boring data, the kind of data that made powerful men's eyes glaze over. And that was exactly the point. You cannot steal what you cannot understand, and you cannot understand what you do not have the patience to read. The summer brought growth in every direction. New families arrived every week, 2 from the south, 3 from the east, a group of 7 from a mining settlement that had collapsed when its vein ran dry. They brought skills Ison needed desperately: stonework, carpentry, metalwork. The blacksmith among them set up a forge using local coal from a seam Ison had identified in the hills, and within a month he was producing tools: iron shovels, picks, hoe blades. The upgrade from wooden tools to iron tools doubled the digging speed overnight. More channels, more wells, more prepared land. The feedback loop accelerated. Better tools meant faster work, meant more food, meant more people, meant more skills, meant better tools. Ison watched the loop spin and marveled at a truth he had known intellectually his whole life, but had never felt viscerally until now. Civilization is a flywheel. The hardest part is the first push. After that, momentum does most of the work. By the end of summer, Somak had 212 people. The fields stretched across 12 hectares. The channel network was over 3 li of total length. The first permanent buildings were going up, not rammed earth shelters, but actual structures with stone foundations and clay brick walls and timber roofs. The potter had trained 2 apprentices and was producing glazed ceramics using a technique Ison suggested, based on half-remembered lectures about Korean celadon. The glaze was not celadon. It was greenish and lumpy and cracked in unpredictable ways. But it held water, and it was beautiful in its imperfection. And traders from Haryong began asking for it by name. Somakware, a product, a brand, a reason for outside money to flow into the settlement. Ison had not planned this. The potter had simply made something good, and people wanted it. The market was doing what markets do. Soyeon returned from a visit to Haryong one evening with news that changed the color of the autumn. The provincial governor had taken notice of Somak, not because of the ceramics or the population growth, because of the water. The drought was entering its 4th year. 3 provinces to the south were in crisis. Rivers that had flowed for centuries were running dry. Rice paddies that had fed millions were cracking in the sun. The governor had received reports of a settlement in the western waste that had somehow found water in the driest land in the empire. He wanted to know more. Soyeon said an official inquiry had been opened. Not hostile, not yet. But official inquiries had a way of becoming hostile when they found things worth taking. Ison absorbed this. The provincial governor, a level above anything he had dealt with, above Hosok, above the magistrate of Haryong. The governor controlled troops and tax collectors and courts and the full machinery of provincial administration. If the governor decided that Somak's water belonged to the province, Ison had no legal mechanism to resist. He was a 4th son of a minor house with a land deed and a collection of wells. The governor was the emperor's representative with authority over everything between the mountains and the sea. That night, Ison stood on the dune above the settlement and looked down at what he had built. Lights flickered in the windows of 200 shelters. The sound of the potter's wheel hummed in the distance. Children's voices carried on the wind. The barley fields were dark rectangles against the pale sand. 12 hectares of impossible green in a world of beige. 212 people sleeping safely in a place that 2 years ago was a graveyard of sand. He had done this. Not alone, with Park Min-hoo's hands and Yeonhwa's iron will, and Soa's quick mind, and Soyeon's beautiful numbers, and Hayden's quiet knowledge, and the labor and faith of every person who had walked into this desert and decided to stay. But the idea had been his. The knowledge had been his. And now that knowledge had made something worth taking. The curse of success. Build something valuable in a world of scarcity, and every predator within smelling distance will come for it. He had known this would happen. He had planned for it. But standing on that dune, in the dark, with the wind pulling at his clothes, he felt the weight of what was coming settle onto him like sand accumulating grain by grain until the dune itself shifts. He went back down and sat with Park Min-hoo by the first well, the well that had started everything. The old man was awake, as he often was on warm nights, sitting with his back against the stone lip and looking at the stars. Ison sat beside him and told him about the governor's inquiry and about Hosok's letter. Park Min-hoo listened and was quiet for a long time. Then he said that in his 27 years as steward, he had learned one thing about powerful men. The town charter application required 14 documents. Soyeon listed them on the first morning. Population register with household heads named and stamped. Land survey with boundary markers certified by a provincial surveyor. Water source inventory. Agricultural output record for no fewer than 2 consecutive harvests. Tax compliance certificate. Infrastructure inventory, including roads, wells, and public buildings. A formal petition signed by the estate lord and countersigned by at least 3 household heads. A letter of no objection from the nearest magistrate, and 6 more forms, each more obscure than the last. Ison looked at the list and felt the familiar weight of bureaucracy settling over him like a blanket made of paperwork. In his old life, he had dealt with Korean government agencies and Chinese provincial offices and international grant committees. This was worse. Not because the forms were more complex, but because each one required physical travel to a different office, and the offices were spread across the province at distances measured in days of walking. He divided the work. Kim Doo-soo would handle the population register and the tax compliance certificate. He knew the forms. He had the seals. He could produce documents that looked exactly like what the provincial office expected to see because he had spent his career producing exactly such documents. Soyeon would handle the agricultural records and the water inventory. She had the data already. She just needed to transcribe it into the official format. Ison would handle the land survey himself and the magistrate's letter. The rest, they would figure out as they went. The land survey was the critical piece. Without a certified boundary survey, no charter could be issued, and a certified survey required a provincial surveyor. Ison sent a message to Go Taishik in Haryang asking for advice. The magistrate replied within a week. The nearest provincial surveyor was based in the district capital of Yeongju, 4 days' ride east. His name was Baek Jung-ho. He was expensive, he was slow, and he was honest, which in this world was the rarest of the 3 qualities. Ison could not afford expensive. He could barely afford to feed his people, let alone hire a district surveyor. But he could offer what he always offered: water. He rode to Yeongju on a horse borrowed from Go Taishik. 4 days across increasingly settled land. Towns and villages that grew denser as he moved east. Irrigated fields fed by rivers that still flowed, although lower than usual. The drought was present here, but not dominant. Life continued. Markets operated. Officials went about their business. Yeongju itself was a proper town. Walls, gates, a garrison. Government buildings with tiled roofs and painted eaves. The surveyor's office was in a side street near the records hall. Baek Jung-ho was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a permanent squint from years of reading fine script in poor light. He listened to Ison's request with professional neutrality. He said a boundary survey of 80 li would take 2 weeks on site and cost 40 nyang of silver. Ison said he had no silver. Jung-ho began to close his ledger. Ison said he had water. Jung-ho's hand stopped. Ison explained. The surveyor's district included 17 settlements in the western region that were struggling with drought. Ison would survey water sources for 3 of them, free. The surveyor would receive credit for facilitating the water discovery. In government reports, credit was currency. Jung-ho studied him for a long time. Then, he opened his ledger again and asked when Ison wanted to start. They returned to Sommak together. 2 weeks on site became 3 because Jung-ho was thorough in a way that Ison respected. Every boundary marker was placed with surveying instruments calibrated to standards that Ison recognized as roughly equivalent to 18th century European precision. Not perfect, but far better than guesswork. Jung-ho measured angles with a wooden protractor and distances with a calibrated chain, and recorded everything in a notation system that Soyeon immediately understood and began cross-referencing with her own maps. By the end of the 3rd week, they had a certified boundary survey that would stand up in any provincial court. Jung-ho stamped it with his official seal and handed it to Ison and said he looked forward to seeing the water surveys. Ison said he would deliver them within the month. They shook hands. Jung-ho rode east. Ison stood holding the survey and felt the first piece of the shield click into place. The magistrate's letter was easier. Go Taishik had become something close to an ally over the past year. The wells Ison had found for Haryong were producing steadily, and the town's situation had improved measurably. The magistrate wrote a letter of no objection that was more than just approval. It was an endorsement. He praised the development of Somak as an example of effective land stewardship in difficult conditions. He noted the positive impact on regional water resources. He stamped it with his magistrate's seal and added his personal seal beside it, which Soyan said carried additional weight in provincial proceedings. Kim Dusu completed the population register and tax certificate in 5 days. His work was immaculate, every character perfect, every seal crisp, every number aligned. He presented the documents to Ison without ceremony and without comment, and returned to his desk and continued writing his regular report to Chon Hosok, the report that said nothing interesting was happening in Somak. While the paperwork accumulated, Ison focused on the physical infrastructure that a town charter required: roads, public buildings, a market space. The roads were simple, packed earth surfaces running between the major wells and the fields. He graded them with a slight crown in the center so rainwater would drain to the sides. He lined the drainage channels with stone. The market was a cleared area near the central well, with stone benches and a wooden roof for shade. Simple, but defined. A public space. The public building was harder. A town needed a hall, a place for meetings and records and official business. He designed it himself, a single-story structure 40 paces long and 20 wide, stone foundation, rammed earth walls, timber frame roof with clay tiles. The tiles were the potter's idea. He had been experimenting with flat forms and suggested that roof tiles would sell as well as bowls. He was right. The first batch was uneven and leaked in 3 places, but the concept was sound, and by the time the hall was finished, the roof was tight and the potter had a new product line. The hall was finished on the first day of autumn. 230 people watched the last tile go on. Ison stood in the doorway and looked at the interior. Bare earth floor, whitewashed walls, a long table made from planks cut in the southern hills, benches, a shelf for records, Soyan's maps pinned to the walls, Kim Dusu's ledgers stacked neatly in the corner. It was plain, functional, unremarkable to anyone from his old world. But it was the first public building in Somak in 800 years. The last one had been part of the ancient city beneath their feet. The one that someone had killed by killing its water. Ison thought about that underground city often. He had not gone back since the initial discovery. There was too much to do on the surface, but the ruins were there, waiting, and the questions they raised were getting harder to ignore. Chon Hosuk arrived on the 15th day of autumn. He came with an entourage of 12, 4 personal guards in polished armor, 3 clerks with document cases, 2 servants, a cook, and 2 men whose function was not immediately clear. They wore plain robes and said nothing and watched everything. Hosuk himself rode at the front on a gray horse of obvious quality. He was 31, tall, lean, handsome in the way that well-fed, well-bred men are handsome. His clothes were expensive without being ostentatious. His bearing was that of a man who had never in his life questioned whether he belonged in any room he entered. He dismounted at the edge of the settlement and looked around, and his face showed nothing. Not surprise, not contempt, not admiration. Professional blankness. The same expression Kim Dusu had worn on his first day, the family trait. Ison met him at the town hall. They sat across the table from each other, brothers who had not seen each other in over a year, brothers who had barely known each other before that. Hosuk spoke first. He said the settlement was impressive. He said the reports had not done it justice. He said he was proud that the family name was associated with such industrious development. Every word was smooth and warm and precisely calibrated to convey respect while establishing authority. Ison recognized the technique. He had seen it in corporate negotiations in his old life. The praise that precedes the pivot. He waited for the pivot. Hosok said he had been thinking about Somok's future. He said a settlement of this promise deserved more than a fourth son's modest resources. He said the House of Chon had connections and capital that could accelerate development dramatically. Partnerships with southern merchants, access to imperial trade routes, political cover at the provincial level. All of this could be arranged for a reasonable consideration. Ison asked what the consideration was. Hosok smiled. He said he thought a shared stewardship arrangement would benefit everyone. The legal framework already existed for elder brothers to assume co-administration of family estates. He said he had taken the liberty of drafting the documents. One of the silent men in plain robes produced a scroll from his case and placed it on the table. Ison unrolled it. The document was dense with legal language, but the substance was simple. Co-stewardship meant Hosok would have equal authority over Somok. Equal authority in practice meant superior authority because Hosok held the family headship, and in any dispute, the family head's decision was final. Signing this document would make Ison a steward of his own land, a manager working for his brother. Everything he had built would belong to Hosok in all but name. Ison read the document completely, every character. He took his time. Hosok waited with the patience of a man who believed the outcome was predetermined. When Ison finished, he rolled the scroll and placed it on the table, and said he needed time to consider. Hosok's smile did not waver. He said, "Of course." He said there was no rush. He said he would enjoy a tour of the estate while his brother deliberated. And then he stood and walked outside and began his tour with the two silent men at his shoulders writing notes. 10 days. Ison divided the remaining documents among the three people he trusted most with paper. Soyeon took the infrastructure inventory and the public services declaration. Kim Dusu took the historical land use affidavit, which required witness statements from long-term residents about the condition of the land before and after development. Ison himself took the final piece, the formal petition of establishment, which needed not only his signature and seal, but a detailed narrative of the town's founding and purpose. A document meant to convince a provincial review board that this place deserved to exist as a recognized community under imperial law. He wrote it at night, after the days spent showing Hosok around the settlement, because that was the other game being played simultaneously. Hosok toured every morning with his silent observers. He examined the wells. He tasted the water. He walked the fields and counted the rows and estimated yields with a practiced eye that told Ison his brother was no fool when it came to agriculture. He visited the potter's workshop and watched the kiln fire and picked up a finished bowl and turned it in his hands with genuine appreciation. He ate meals with the workers and spoke to them with an ease that was either natural charm or decades of practiced aristocratic politeness. Ison could not tell which. Hosok asked intelligent questions about the irrigation schedule, about the crop rotation, about the clay sourcing for the channels. He did not ask how Ison knew these things. He did not seem interested in the how, only in the what existed, what it produced, what it was worth. These were the questions of a man evaluating an acquisition, not understanding a creation. On the third day of Hosok's visit, Chonmeyer arrived. She came over the northern dunes at a run, a small figure with two swords strapped to her back and a pack bouncing against her shoulders and legs that covered ground with the efficiency of someone who had been running her whole life. She did not stop at the edge of the settlement. She ran straight to the central well and drank for 2 minutes and then looked up and saw Ison standing nearby and said she had heard there was food here. She was 17. Skinny in a way that went beyond thin into the territory of prolonged deprivation. Her clothes were torn and restitched so many times, the original fabric was a matter of speculation. The two swords on her back were real and well-maintained, and completely at odds with the rest of her appearance. They were the swords of a soldier. She was a child. Ison gave her food. She ate 3 bowls of barley porridge and half a loaf of bread and a plate of pickled turnips and showed no sign of slowing down. While she ate, he pieced together her story from the fragments she offered between bites. Her name was Chon Ison, daughter of Chon Ison, a name Ison did not recognize, but Pak Min-hoo did. The old man went still when he heard it. He told Ison later that Chon Ison had been a general, one of the best in the imperial army, executed 3 years ago for refusing to withdraw from the eastern border during a political dispute between 2 princes. His lands were seized, his family was scattered, his name was struck from the military rolls. His daughter had been wandering since, chased from town to town, because harboring the child of a condemned traitor was a crime in several provinces. She had survived by fighting, by running, by eating whatever she could find and sleeping wherever she could hide. She had heard about somak from a merchant on the road and walked for 6 days on half a water skin. Ison did not ask her to stay. He did not offer her terms or conditions. He called the carpenter and asked him to build a door for the empty shelter at the east end of the settlement. The carpenter asked what kind of door. Ison said, a good one, with a nameplate. The carpenter asked whose name. Ison said, Chanmeyer. The door was finished the next day. Ison showed it to her without ceremony. He said this was her room. It would be her room whether she stayed a day or a year or 10 years. She stood in front of the door and looked at the wooden plate with her name carved into it, and her face did something complicated that involved no tears, but was more painful to watch than tears would have been. She touched the nameplate with 2 fingers, lightly, as if it might disappear. Then she went inside and closed the door, and did not come out until the next morning. Hosak noticed her. Of course he noticed her. He noticed everything. On the 4th day of his visit, he casually mentioned to Ison that harboring the child of a condemned traitor could be interpreted as a political statement. Ison said he was not making a political statement. He was feeding a hungry child. Hosak said the distinction might not matter to the provincial court. Ison said the provincial court could come and see a hungry child eating porridge and draw their own conclusions. Hosak looked at him for a long time. Then he smiled that precise, measured smile and changed the subject. Mide appointed herself as Ison's guard. Nobody asked her to. Nobody assigned the role. She simply began following him at a distance of 10 paces with her swords on her back and her eyes scanning every direction. When Hosak's guards were present, she positioned herself between them and Ison. She was half their size. She did not care. Yanhua watched this and said nothing, but her mouth twitched in something that was not quite a smile. Hedin examined the girl's hands and found calluses on top of calluses, and old cuts that had healed badly, and malnutrition damage in her nails and her teeth. She prepared a regimen of herbal supplements and nutrient-rich foods specifically for Meyer. The girl accepted the treatments with the same silence she applied to everything. She did not thank anyone, she did not speak much at all. But every morning, she touched the nameplate on her door. Ison saw her do it. He said nothing. Some things were better left alone. The documents progressed. Kim Dusu collected witness statements from 9 long-term residents. Each one testified to the condition of the land before Ison's arrival, and the changes since. Pak Min-hoo's statement was the most detailed. 27 years of stewardship, 3 failed lords, no water, no crops, no hope. And then the 4th lord arrived and knelt in the sand and said, "Dig here." Kim Dusu transcribed these statements in his immaculate hand and stamped each one with the estate seal and organized them in chronological order and bound them with cord and placed them in the document case. Soyan completed the infrastructure inventory in 6 days. Every well, every channel, every building, every road. Measured and recorded and cross-referenced with her maps. The Public Services Declaration listed the water supply system and the agricultural operations and the market and the town hall and the herbalist's practice as a medical facility. She stretched the definition slightly. Ison approved. He finished the founding petition on the 8th night. Sitting at the table in the hall with a single lamp and the sound of Hosok's guards playing dice in the shelter across the road. The petition was 4 pages long. He wrote it in the formal register of aristocratic correspondence, which this world required for official documents, but he kept the content plain. He wrote about the water, the first well, the look on Pak Min-hoo's face. He wrote about the soil, the slow, patient process of washing salt from sand and replacing it with life. He wrote about the people, 51 who came because they had nowhere else, 100 more who came because they chose to. He wrote about the rotation system, and the channels, and the greenhouse, and the ceramics, and the market, and the school that Soa was already running informally for the children. He did not write about his brother's visit, or the co-stewardship proposal, or the threat that hung over everything. He wrote about what Somak was, not what it was threatened by. The petition ended with a single statement. Somak is a town because its people have made it one. This document asks only that the law recognize what the land already knows. On the 9th day, the final document was ready, the comprehensive charter application. 14 items, bound and sealed and organized in a leather case that Soyeon had commissioned from a craftsman in Haryong. It was complete. 9 days instead of 10. Kim Doo-soo had slept a total of 12 hours in the entire period. Soyeon had slept less. Ison had not counted his own hours. It did not matter. The case was ready. It needed to reach the provincial office in Yeongju before Hosok could file his co-stewardship petition. And Yeongju was 4 days' ride east. Ison could not go himself. Hosok was still in Somak, and leaving would look like flight. Soyeon could not go. Her departure would signal the legal strategy. Kim Doo-soo's departure would be reported to Hosok immediately by the guards. There was only one person who could make the journey without raising suspicion, a person no one was watching. A person who could cover ground faster than a horse if she chose to. Ison found Meyer on the roof of her shelter, where she slept most nights, regardless of the weather. He climbed up and sat beside her and told her what he needed. A document case carried to Yeongju and delivered to the provincial registry office. 4 days riding, maybe 3 if the horse was fast. She listened. Then she said she did not ride horses. She said she would run. He looked at her thin frame and her hard eyes, and he believed her. She took the case at dawn. She went north first, as if heading for the hills. Then she cut east through the dune fields, where horses could not follow and riders could not see. She ran. Ison stood on the dune and watched her disappear and put the fate of his town in the hands of a 17-year-old girl with 2 swords and no shoes. Hosok stayed 3 more days. He toured. He observed. He ate Ison's food and drank Ison's water and slept in Ison's town hall. And on the morning of the 12th day, he approached Ison with the co-stewardship scroll and asked if he had considered the offer. Ison said he had considered it and respectfully declined. Hosok's face did not change. He said he was sorry to hear that. He said he hoped Ison would not regret the decision. He mounted his gray horse and rode south with his entourage, and the dust of their departure hung in the air for an hour. That evening, a trader from Haryong brought word that Mire had passed through 3 days ago, heading east at a pace that had impressed even the town's fastest courier. She had stopped only to fill her water skin and eat 2 rice cakes, and then she was gone. On the 7th day after her departure, Mire returned. She came from the east at a walk this time, tired, dusty, thinner than when she left. She walked into the settlement and handed Ison a stamped receipt from the provincial registry office confirming submission of charter application number 417 for the township of Somak, filed and recorded and entered into the provincial docket for review. Ison held the receipt and read it twice. Then he looked at Mire. She was swaying slightly on her feet. He told her to go eat. She turned toward the kitchen. Then she stopped. She said there was something else. She said that in Yeongju, she had seen two men in plain robes at the registry office. The same plain robes as the observers who had accompanied Hoseok. They had been filing a document when she arrived. She did not know what it was, but she had arrived before them. She was sure of that. She had been first. The provincial review process took time. Soyeon said it could be weeks or months, depending on the backlog and the interest level of the reviewing officials. In the meantime, Somak continued to grow. The autumn harvest was the largest yet, 380 kilograms of barley from 12 hectares. Not a high yield by the standards of established farmland, but extraordinary for reclaimed desert in its second year of cultivation. The beans produced another 60 kilograms. The greenhouse, which Ison had expanded during the summer, grew turnips and radishes and a new crop, melons. Small, pale melons with green flesh that tasted sweet and cool. Soa had planted the seeds from a batch Heron acquired through a traveling herbalist. The first melon harvest was tiny, 12 fruits, but the flavor was so striking that Ison immediately allocated a section of the greenhouse for expanded melon cultivation. In a climate where sweetness was rare and sugar was imported at enormous cost, a local source of sweet fruit was more valuable than its weight suggested. The Kyaris project began that autumn. This was the plan Ison had been developing since he first surveyed the southern hills. A Kyaris was an underground water channel, a tunnel dug into the base of a hillside at a slight downward grade that intercepted the water table and allowed groundwater to flow by gravity through the tunnel to the surface at a lower elevation. The technology was ancient on Earth. The Persians had built them thousands of years ago. The Koreans had used similar systems in the Goryeo dynasty. The principle was simple. The execution was brutal. Miles of underground tunnel dug by hand in the dark. Vertical shafts every 50 paces for ventilation and soil removal. Clay lining to prevent collapse. Precise gradient control so the water flowed fast enough to be useful, but not so fast it eroded the tunnel walls. It was the hardest thing Ison had attempted in this world, and it was the key to everything that came next. He explained the concept to Yeonhwa and Pak Min-hoo using a model he built from clay and sticks. A hillside, an underground tunnel, water flowing through it, emerging at the surface 12 li away near Somak. Yeonhwa studied the model and asked how much water. Ison said, more than all the wells combined. Continuous flow, day and night, year-round. Immune to drought because the source was deep groundwater, fed by the hills, not surface rain. She asked how long it would take to build. He said, a year, maybe more. She looked at the model and then at him and said they had better start now. The digging began at the hill end. Ison surveyed the entry point with the same precision he applied to everything. The tunnel mouth was cut into a limestone face at an angle that intersected the water table 20 chi below the surface. The first team of diggers went in with lamps and picks and came out 2 hours later covered in mud and rock dust and swearing. Underground work was different from open digging. The darkness, the closeness, the knowledge that the earth above you was held up by nothing but its own weight. Not everyone could handle it. 2 men refused to go back after the first day. Ison did not force them. He could not afford injuries from panic. He reassigned them to surface work and found others who could tolerate the tunnel. The work was slow, 20 paces of tunnel per week if conditions were good, less if they hit hard rock or soft sand that collapsed behind them. Ison designed timber bracing for the weak sections and clay lining for the walls. He stood in the tunnel himself, marking the direction and gradient with a level he had built from a straight stick and a bowl of water. When the bubble centered, the stick was level. When it tilted left, the tunnel was angling downhill. When it tilted right, they were going uphill and needed to correct. Simple tools, simple physics. Maddening precision required over distances measured in li. While the Charis advanced, Ison dealt with a more immediate challenge, the school. Soa had been teaching children informally since the spring, reading and writing from books that Soyeon brought from Haryong and basic arithmetic and the beginning of what Ison had started calling earth reading, how to look at soil and sand and plants and understand what they meant. Soa was good at it, better than good. She had absorbed Ison's teaching with the hunger of someone who had lived her whole life thinking she had no future and had suddenly discovered that the future was made of knowable things. She taught the children the way Ison taught her, not by lecturing, but by showing. Here is a bug. It lives here because the soil is moist here. Why is the soil moist? Because water rises through fine sand by the same force that pulls water up through a cloth. Pull a strip of cloth through a bowl of water and watch. See how the water climbs. That is what happens underground. The children understood this, some of them better than the adults. Ison formalized the school on the first day of the settlement's second winter. A room in the town hall set aside for teaching. Soa as the teacher. Soyeon as the mathematics instructor 2 days per week, Haerin teaching plant identification and basic medicine 1 day per week, Ison himself teaching earth reading whenever he could spare the time. He made Soa a gift on the day the school opened, a sapling, an apricot tree grown from a seed that Haerin had carried in her pack from the eastern provinces. He planted it with Soa in the ground beside the school entrance. He said this was her tree. When it bore fruit, she would be a grown woman, and the fruit would feed her children. She held the sapling while he packed the soil around its roots, and her hands were steady, and her eyes were bright, and she did not say anything, because sometimes the largest feelings have no words. She watered that tree every morning before school, every single morning, even in winter, even when she had to break ice to fill the bucket. The whole settlement knew nobody touched the apricot tree. Not because anyone said not to, because some things are understood without being spoken. The second winter was less desperate than the first. The expanded greenhouse produced through the cold months. The grain stores were larger, the foraged supplements were gathered earlier and in greater quantity. Haerin's medical preparations kept the worst of the cold sickness at bay. Nobody died. This fact hung unspoken over the settlement, like a held breath released. In the first winter, they had lost no Jinso. In the second winter, they lost no one. Ison did not celebrate this. You do not celebrate the absence of death, but he noted it, and Yeonhwa noted it. And on the coldest night of the season, she brought him a bowl of soup and sat beside him and said nothing. And the silence between them was the warmest thing in the room. In the depths of that second winter, Ison went underground, not into the Tiares, into the ruins. He had put off this exploration for too long. The questions had been building since the initial discovery of ancient stonework during the first Tiares survey. Now, with the tunnel advancing steadily southward into the hills, the diggers were encountering more and more signs of previous construction. Carved stone blocks, fragments of ceramic pipe, a section of perfectly fitted floor tile at a depth that suggested it had been buried for centuries. Ison took a lamp and 2 volunteers and went in. The ruins were extensive, far more extensive than he had imagined. What he had thought was a collapsed cellar turned out to be the upper level of a multi-story underground complex. Halls with arched ceilings, rooms with stone benches, channels cut into the floors that had once carried water. And on the walls, writing. Dense columns of characters in a script that was clearly the ancestor of the modern language. Older, more angular, but readable with effort. Ison spent 3 days in the ruins reading the walls. What they told him changed everything he thought he knew about Somak. This had been a city, not a village or an outpost. A city, the capital of the First Empire of Haerin. 800 years ago, this had been the political and cultural center of the entire continent. The population had been over 100,000. The water system had been the most advanced in the known world. Kajara's tunnels running from the mountains for 50 li in every direction, aqueducts, reservoirs, fountains in public squares, gardens on rooftops. The texts described a civilization built on water the same way Ison was building now. And then the texts changed tone. They became urgent, desperate. They described a betrayal. The crown prince, the emperor's own son, dissatisfied with his father's rule, aligned with the southern lords, planning a coup. But a coup required leverage, and the leverage he chose was the city's lifeblood, the water. The prince had the Kajara's tunnels sabotaged, not destroyed, redirected. The water that fed the capital was diverted southward to the lands of his allies, slowly at first, then faster. Wells dried up, reservoirs emptied, gardens turned to dust. The city did not fall in battle, it died of thirst. Over the course of 3 years, the greatest city on the continent withered and crumbled, and its people scattered, and the prince marched in with his southern army and declared a new dynasty with a new capital 300 li to the south. The old city was abandoned, left to the sand, and the desert grew over it like a scar. Spring of the 3rd year opened with 2 arrivals that arrived on the same day as if the road had been saving them for a single moment. The first was a writer from Yangju carrying a sealed document from the provincial registry office. Soyan took it and broke the seal and read it, and her hands trembled and her face did something Ison had never seen before. She looked up and said one word: approved. The charter was approved. Somak was officially recognized as a township under imperial law, with all attendant rights, including the right to self-governance through a council, including the right to refuse administrative interference from external parties without council consent, including protection under the provincial charter statutes, which meant that any legal action against the town required provincial court review, not family court, provincial court, where evidence mattered and bought witnesses were harder to use. She read the full text aloud in the town hall to everyone who could fit inside, and the rest listened through the windows. When she finished, there was silence. Then Pak Min-hoo stood and bowed to the document as if it were a person. The room followed. 270 people bowing to a piece of paper. Because in this world, a piece of paper with the right seal could mean the difference between existing and being erased. The second arrival was Taegyeon. She rode in from the east on a horse that looked like it had run across half the continent. She was 22, dark-skinned from a life in the open, leather riding clothes, a bow slung across her back, and a quiver that was 3/4 empty. Her braid hung to her waist and was thick with dust. She dismounted at the well and watered her horse first and herself second, and then looked around with eyes that were cataloging everything: threat assessment, water sources, defensive positions, escape routes. She was a soldier in everything but name. She said she had been sent by her father, Khan Tegus of the northern Haishan. Her father wanted to know about the settlement in the western desert. He wanted to know if the water was real, and he wanted to know if the man who found it was someone who could be negotiated with or someone who needed to be removed. Ison met her in the town hall. She sat across from him and placed her bow on the table between them. It was not a threat. It was a statement. I am armed. I am not hiding it. Treat me accordingly. He appreciated the directness. She said her people were dying. Not from war, from thirst. The steppes of the northern Haishan had been drying for a generation. The grass that fed their horses was retreating north every year. The rivers that watered their camps were thinning to threads. Her father had tried diplomacy with the empire. The empire offered nothing. Her father had tried raiding. The raids brought food for a month and enemies for a decade. Her father had tried prayer. The gods did not answer. And now he had heard that a man in the western waste could find water in dry ground. He wanted to know if this man could find water in the steppe. Ison asked her to describe the terrain. She did, in detail, with the precision of someone who had spent her life reading landscape for survival. Rocky hills in the north, flat steppe in the center. dry riverbeds in the south. The dominant wind was from the northeast. The rains came twice a year and lasted 3 days each time. The rest of the year was dry and cold in winter and dry and hot in summer. Ison listened and built a mental model. The geology she described was consistent with a karst landscape, limestone base with solution channels and underground caverns. Exactly the kind of terrain where Chiara's systems worked best. He asked about springs. She said there were springs in the northern hills, but they were seasonal, dry for 9 months. He asked about the riverbeds. She said they ran for a few weeks after the rains and then vanished. He asked if the riverbeds had water beneath the surface when they were dry. She looked at him sharply. She said she did not know. Nobody had ever asked that question. He said it was the right question. He told her he would need to see the land himself. She said her father would not welcome an empire lord in his territory. Ison said he was not an empire lord. He was a man who understood dirt. She stared at him. Then she laughed. It was a loud, genuine laugh that startled everyone within earshot. She said he talked like no lord she had ever met. He said that was because he was not one. She stopped laughing, but the amusement stayed in her eyes. She said she would send word to her father. If the Khan agreed, she would take Ison to the steppe herself. Until then, she would wait. Ison said she was welcome to stay. She said she would stay regardless of his welcome. She was assessing his settlement for her father. Before he left, he needed to address the Kajaras. The tunnel had reached the 42nd Li mark, nearly to the point where it should intersect the deep water table flowing from the hills. The gradient was correct. The lining was holding, but they had encountered a problem, a fault line. A crack in the bedrock that ran perpendicular to the tunnel and extended to an unknown depth. Water was seeping through the fault. Not groundwater from the target aquifer, but surface water from above. Seasonal melt, dirty, unreliable. The fault weakened the rock on both sides. The risk of collapse increased significantly. They could tunnel through it with heavy bracing, expensive in timber and time. Or they could route around it, adding 2 more li to the tunnel length and 3 months to the timeline. Or they could seal the fault and tunnel straight through, the fastest option, but the most dangerous. If the seal failed, the tunnel would flood. Ison examined the fault in person. He spent a day in the tunnel with a lamp and his water level tool, measuring the crack. It ran vertically through the limestone for at least 20 chi. The seepage was moderate. The rock on the downstream side was competent, dense limestone without fractures. The rock on the upstream side was weaker, shale layers mixed with the limestone. He made his decision, seal and push through, but not with clay. Clay would wash out under pressure. He needed something stronger. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he remembered Roman hydraulic cement, volcanic ash mixed with lime. It set underwater and hardened to the strength of stone. There was no volcanic ash here, but there was something similar, the coal seam in the southern hills, coal ash. Mixed with the limestone that was everywhere, burned in a kiln to produce a crude version of pozzolanic cement. He had never made it. He had read about it. He had seen demonstration samples in a materials science class 15 years ago in another life. It was a gamble. But it was better than 3 months of detour. The ride took 5 days. The terrain changed gradually. Sand gave way to gravel, gravel gave way to sparse grass. The grass thickened as they moved north. Not lush, not healthy, but present. Living things clinging to a land that was slowly letting go of them. Taegyun pointed out landmarks, a rock formation where her grandmother was buried, a dry creek bed where she caught her first fish as a child, a hill where the tribe gathered for festivals that had grown quieter every year as the young men left to raid and did not come back. She told him these things matter-of-factly, without sentiment, but the information itself was a kind of trust. She was showing him her world, not the strategic version she had shown him in Somak, the real one, the one that was dying. They reached the Khan's camp on the 6th day. A cluster of round, felt tents on a hillside overlooking a dry valley. 300 people. maybe fewer. Horses everywhere. Thin horses. Ison could count the ribs on most of them. The people were lean and hard, and they watched him arrive with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility. The Khan was a large man with gray streaks in his black hair and a scar across his forehead, and eyes that had been making life and death decisions for 30 years. He sat on a wooden stool in front of his tent and looked at Ison for a long time without speaking. Then he said his daughter told him Ison could find water. Ison said he could find water if it was there to be found. The Khan said there was no water here. That was the problem. Ison said there was always water. The question was, how deep and how much? The Khan studied him. Then he said Ison had 3 days. If he found water, the Khan would talk. If he did not, the Khan would escort him back to the border and forget his name. Ison spent the first day walking. The terrain was everything Taegyeon had described and more. A classic karst landscape with exposed limestone ridges and dry river channels and shallow caves in the hillsides. The vegetation was sparse but telling. Certain grasses grew in lines that followed underground moisture. Stunted trees clustered at points where limestone folds created natural water traps. The dry riverbeds were filled with rounded gravel. Water sorted gravel. Gravel shaped by years of flow. These rivers had run strong once. The water table beneath them was still there, just deeper, drawn down by years of drought and the slow geological processes that shifted rock and redirected underground flow. He walked the main riverbed for 4 hours, tasting the gravel, noting the vegetation patterns, checking the exposed rock faces for seepage stains. By evening, he had identified 3 probable well sites and 1 location that was better than a well, a natural spring that had been blocked by a landslide. Limestone rubble had filled a narrow canyon and dammed the underground flow. The water was there, backed up behind the rubble, under pressure. If he could clear the blockage, the spring would flow again. Taejon rode back with him, not as an escort this time, as something else. She did not say what. But when they crested the last dune and Somak appeared below them, she stopped her horse and looked at it. The white walls, the green fields, the smoke from the kiln and the glint of water in the channels. She said quietly that she had never thought a place made by Empire people could look like home. Ison said it was not made by Empire people. It was made by people. She looked at him, and for the first time since they met, the soldier in her eyes stepped aside, and something else looked out. Something that had been sleeping since the rivers ran dry. Ison returned to Somak and found the cement had worked. The coal ash and limestone mixture had sealed the Kajara's fault line overnight. No seepage, no cracking. The tunnel could continue straight through. He went underground that afternoon and pressed his palm against the gray wall, filling the crack from floor to ceiling. Solid. Dense. He told the crew to start digging again. The rock beyond the fault was clean limestone, easy to cut. 6 more li to the aquifer, 4 months at current pace. He began planning the reservoir at the outlet end. 50 paces square, 3 chi deep, cement-reinforced seams. Enough capacity for 30 hectares through 4 months of drought. Soyeon checked the numbers. They worked. Population hit 500. Growth brought disputes over water and garden plots. Ison convened a 7-member town council. Himself, Pak Min-hoo, Yeonhwa, Soyeon, the potter, a retired clerk, 1 rotating seat elected by residents. They set rules for water schedules and building codes and market standards. Mide trained a 30-person militia using farming tools. Not soldiers, but not helpless. Provincial inspectors arrived, demanding assessment of Somak's water for regional drought relief. Soyeon buried them in data. Every number documented, every system explained. They concluded the water was fully committed to local use with no surplus. The Kajari's was not yet operational and not on any record. The shield held. Hosok filed a boundary dispute targeting the Kjuti's entrance. If accepted, the disputed land would freeze and construction would stop. Ison sent a 60-page counterfiling with the surveyor's impeccable records. Then he reversed the dig direction, working from the outlet end toward the aquifer instead of from the entrance. Slower, harder. But the Kjuti's kept advancing. The tunnel broke through on a Tuesday. Water poured through the final rock wall into the shaft. The flow stabilized at 160 liters per minute, 10,000 liters per hour, more than all wells combined multiplied by 3. The reservoir filled in 4 days, a lake in the desert. People came and stared and cried and laughed. Pak Min-hoo sat on the bank with his feet in the water until sundown. 32 hectares planted that spring. Barley and beans and rye and millet and, for the first time, rice. 2 hectares of flooded paddies growing grain that was the currency of this world. Traders stared. They carried the news everywhere. Rice in the desert. The court dismissed Hosok's boundary claim unanimously. Soyeon had found an anachronism in his forged documents. A measurement standard referenced 40 years before it existed. Case dismissed with prejudice. The 2 tunnel sections met in the middle with alignment error under half a chi. Population surged to 3,500. Glass and ceramics workshops expanded. Soa's school grew to 40 students. Her metaphors for underground water systems were better than Ison's own. Ison explored the sealed ruins beneath Somak, the ancient capital of the First Empire, destroyed 800 years ago when the crown prince diverted its water to seize power. The founding secret of the current dynasty written on underground walls. He told no one. He sealed the entrance deeper and carried the weight alone. By the 5th year, Somak had 15,000 people. White-walled streets angled to sweep sand clear. Evaporative cooling channels. Heron's clinic with 6 apprentices and the lowest infant mortality in the province. The emperor sent an envoy. Lord Kwan proclaimed Somak a city and installed himself as permanent inspector. Mire reported that Kwan was afraid, not of Somak, of what he could not explain to his superiors. The drought broke in the 6th year with catastrophic floods. Somak's drainage systems held. Every other province suffered. Somak opened its granaries and fed 3 provinces. Chon Hosok arrived alone. His vineyards were dead. He asked for water. Ison poured him a cup of Chara's water in a green-glazed Somak cup and said nothing. Then he promised to survey the dead vineyards and teach Hosok's people to build Chara's systems. He wanted nothing in return. Water was not something you trade. Water was something you share. Hosok bowed, a full bow. He said their father gave Ison the desert as a test, and Ison was the only son who passed. The 3rd prince proposed a monopoly on Ison's methods in exchange for imperial backing. Ison rejected it. The same day, he published a textbook, Everything He Knew, 100 copies sent to every provincial capital and library in the empire, free. The knowledge could not be caged. The trial came in the 7th year. Charges of forbidden magic and sedition. Ison defended himself with dirt samples and diagrams and 7 years of records. He spoke plainly. He said the land does not care about dynasties. Give it water and it lives. Take the water away and it dies. He never mentioned the ruins. All charges dismissed. The emperor decided Somak was not a threat, but an asset. Ison walked out of the court into rain. Rain caused by 5 years of his reforestation pumping moisture into the atmosphere. He had changed the sky. Soyeon appeared with an umbrella and said the rain was interfering with her documents. He said the rain was his fault. She said she knew. She had already tracked the data and connected the trees to the rainfall patterns. He said they should go home. She said yes. He returned to Somak. 20,000 people in a city that should not exist. He walked to the first well. Water still flowing, clean and cold. He looked at Soa's apricot tree, heavy with fruit. children picking and eating and laughing. She was 25 now, teaching the next generation. The tree was not his anymore. It was theirs. He sat at his desk and began drawing plans for the second charas. There was always another well to dig. The desert would wait, and he would answer it the only way he knew, one shovel at a time, until the land remembered what it had been.